It all began on a quiet Saturday morning when I was walking the perimeter of my ranch, the land my family had held for 3 generations, stretching out with rolling hills, an oak-lined creek, and pasture fences that had weathered storms longer than most people in town had been alive, when I noticed something strange at the edge, near the subdivision that had sprung up just 5 years earlier. Freshly posted signs nailed to posts, each one stamped with bold black letters, "Private. Property HOA enforced. Trespassers will be prosecuted." At first I thought it was a prank, because the land where those signs stood was mine. Every acre documented in the county plat, the deed secured, the title clear. But then I noticed more, a freshly built chain-link fence that cut across one of my long-used ranch roads, a stretch I had driven my truck across just a week before without a thought, and beyond the fence a cluster of newly poured concrete slabs, where I knew the homeowners association had been planning to extend their so-called community walking trail. My gut clenched, because this wasn't just a neighbor being careless with a lawnmower or edging over a property line. This was deliberate encroachment, a hostile staking of claim, and before I could even collect my thoughts, she appeared, striding toward me with a clipboard clutched in one hand and a cell phone in the other, her expression radiating the smug self-assurance I had come to recognize in the woman the neighborhood quietly referred to as Karen, though her real name was Sandra Mitchell, self-appointed president of the HO, self-styled queen of the cul-de-sac. She barked at me before I even spoke. "You're trespassing. This is HOA maintained land now, and we've already voted on it. Leave before I call the police." For a moment, I just stared at her, incredulous, because the sheer gall of someone standing on my soil, looking me in the eye, and declaring ownership as though words could rewrite recorded deeds was almost laughable. But the thing about people like Karen is that their confidence isn't built on reason. It's built on intimidation, and she thought if she spoke loudly enough, quickly enough, I'd just back down like so many of her HOAS residents had when faced with fines or letters or threats of foreclosure. I finally answered her, my voice calm but edged with steel. "Lady, you've got about 30 seconds to step back behind your subdivision fence before I call the sheriff myself. You're standing on my ranch, not your HOAS playland." That's when she smirked and raised her phone, snapping photos of me like I was the intruder. "We'll see what the cops say," she sneered, dialing right in front of me. I almost laughed, because little did she know, I not only had the paperwork that proved ownership, but had friends at the county recorder's office, the sheriff's department, and the planning commission, all of whom knew this land had belonged to the Rileys since the early 1900s. When the squad car pulled up 15 minutes later, lights flashing across the fence line, I could see the smugness swell in Corin's posture, like she'd already won. But the deputy who stepped out of the cruiser, Deputy Harlan, a man I'd gone to high school with and played ball alongside, didn't even need to hear much before his eyes cut to me with a grin. "Riley, what's going on here?" "Heard we had a trespass call." Karen jumped in, voice shrill, insisting that I was the intruder, that this was HOA-controlled land, that I was intimidating her. But when I pulled the folded deed from my back pocket and handed it to Harlan, his smile widened and he turned to her. "Ma'am, this here shows this land is his, plain as day. You've got no jurisdiction here, and if you keep this fence up, you're the one trespassing." The look on her face was priceless shock, giving way to fury, fury masked by denial, denial morphing back into arrogance as she stammered something about pending HOA claims and easement rights. But Harlan wasn't buying it. He gave her a warning right there: tear down the fence or face charges. She stormed off in a huff, her phone glued to her ear, already calling the HOA board members to rally them into her next scheme. And that's when I knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because people like Karen don't back down when they're wrong. They double down, they escalate, and they drag others down with them. As I stood there, watching her retreat, I realized I was about to be thrust into a war, not just for my land, but for my peace. Because Karen and her AOA declared themselves sovereign over ground they didn't own, and if they thought I was going to roll over, they were about to learn the hard way that you don't pick a fight with a man whose roots run deeper than your subdivision's foundation. The warning Deputy Harlan gave Karen should have been enough to end it right there, but I knew the moment I saw her storm off clutching that phone that this woman wasn't going to let it go. Karen was the type who thrived on control, someone who measured her own worth by how much power she could exert over others. And in her mind, conceding defeat wasn't an option, it wasn't even in her vocabulary. Sure enough, within 48 hours, I began receiving letters in the mail, each one stamped with the HOA's official header, each one written in that condescending legalese they used to scare homeowners into paying fines. The first one claimed, I was in violation of community standards by operating unauthorized agricultural equipment within HOA boundaries. The second accused me of impeding the development of approved community amenities. By the third, they were demanding $30,000 in back association dues for being a so-called adjacent property member. I almost spit out my coffee when I read that one, because the sheer absurdity of it was beyond belief. Not only was I'm not a member of their HOA, but my land predated their subdivision by nearly 80 years, and the plat maps clearly showed a thick black line dividing their world from mine. These letters were more than just harassment. They were the opening salvo of a campaign meant to wear me down, to scare me into caving. But I wasn't some retiree worried about his lawn height or a young couple scared of foreclosure threats. I was a landowner, and I had every legal right to push back. My first call was to the county recorder's office, where my friend Denise pulled the records and confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had no legal claim, no easements, no boundaries that touched mine. My second call was to my attorney, Jameson, a sharp man with a reputation for dismantling frivolous claims. He laughed so hard when I read him the letters that I thought he'd choke, but then his tone shifted into that calm seriousness I knew meant business. Riley, they're bluffing, but bluffing can still cause damage if you don't answer. We'll draft a cease and desist. If they ignore it, we'll file a suit for harassment and damages. This HOA's about to walk into a buzzsaw. And that's when I realized just how big this could get, because if Karen was stupid enough to escalate, her whole HOA could be dragged into a courtroom where every lie, every misuse of funds, every unlawful threat would be exposed under oath. And believe me, small-town HOAs love their secrecy. They love hiding behind newsletters and board meetings and made-up rules, but once you drag them under fluorescent lights in front of a judge, they crumble. Over the next week, things went from bad to worse. Karen showed up at the fence line. 3 times, each time with a different board member in tow. First was Dale, the treasurer, a balding man who clearly wanted no part of the confrontation, his eyes darting nervously as Karen screamed about rights of way and common access. Then came Melanie, the secretary, who stood silently as Karen jabbed her finger in my face, demanding I pay fines or face community liens. Finally, she brought Mark, the vice president, a guy with too much swagger for his own good, who puffed out his chest and threatened to bring the county down on me. What none of them realized was that the county already knew whose land this was. Denise had forwarded the situation to the county surveyor, and word was spreading among officials that this HOA was trying to annex property outside its jurisdiction. That's not just a civil matter, it's potentially criminal, especially if money is involved. Still, I let them rant, I let them scream, because I knew the longer they dug their heels in, the deeper their hole would get. The breaking point came one morning when I found heavy machinery parked near the disputed fence. HOA contractors ready to start grading land for that so-called trail. They were 20 feet onto my property line, engines rumbling, waiting for orders. I didn't yell, I didn't argue. I simply called the sheriff's office, then stood by with my arms crossed as the deputies rolled up. Karen arrived minutes later, heels clicking across the dirt, clipboard in hand, shouting that they had unanimous board approval. Harlan was there again, and this time he wasn't smiling. He read the deed out loud in front of everyone, then turned to the contractors and said, "Pack it up. You're trespassing. You keep working, and I'll impound the equipment." The contractors scrambled, engines cut, trucks backed up. Karen's face turned beet red as she shrieked about abuse of power, threatening to sue the county itself. That was the moment she crossed a line she couldn't uncross. because within hours, a complaint had been filed at the county attorney's office. Not by me, but by the sheriff's department, documenting attempted encroachment, harassment, and interference with law enforcement. And when the county attorney gets involved, things move fast. Karen thought she was playing HOA politics, but what she'd really done was invite the weight of the law onto her board's shoulders. That night, Jameson called me with a grin in his voice. They just walked into a courtroom they don't even see coming. Keep every letter, every voicemail, every photo. We're going to dismantle their entire operation piece by piece. And, I knew then this wasn't just about my ranch anymore. This was about exposing the rot at the heart of an HOA that thought it could strong-arm whoever it pleased. The county attorney's involvement shifted the entire balance of power overnight, because until that moment, Karen and her little HOA believed they were playing a private game of intimidation and bluster, the kind they'd won dozens of times. Before against weak-willed homeowners who didn't know their rights, but when the county stepped in, suddenly the stakes weren't about HOA newsletters or violation fines anymore. They were about fraud, unlawful enforcement, misuse of association, funds, and potentially criminal trespassing. I could practically feel the panic radiating from Karen and her board the moment the first subpoenas went out, demanding the HOA's financial records, board meeting minutes, and all communications relating to me and my land. And let me tell you, HOA boards live in mortal fear of those kinds of audits, because behind the curtain of community service, there's almost always a nest of shady bookkeeping, questionable contracts, and backdoor deals. Karen, of course, doubled down at first, barking about how this was all a misunderstanding, claiming the county was overstepping. But the more she ranted, the clearer it became she wasn't just in over her head, she was dragging the entire board down with her. The first cracks appeared when Dale, the treasurer, started distancing himself, whispering to county investigators that he had concerns about how funds were being used, especially after Karen approved thousands of dollars in legal retainers without board approval. Then Melanie, the secretary, quietly turned over emails showing Karen had knowingly misrepresented my land as community access property to justify dues increases. Within a week, the investigation had escalated into a full-blown inquiry into whether the HOA had committed fraud by collecting fees under false pretenses. And all the while, I stayed quiet, letting the process chew them up. But I wasn't idle. I was documenting every call, every fence-line confrontation, every threatening letter, feeding it to Jameson, who was carefully building a civil case, parallel to the county's criminal one. The beauty of it was that Karen couldn't stop herself from making things worse. She left voicemails screaming about how I'd regret messing with her and how the board will take you for everything. She sent late-night emails accusing me of harboring aggressive livestock and endangering the community's safety, as though my cows were plotting to storm their subdivision. Every threat, every baseless accusation, every insane claim was another nail in her coffin. And then came the day I'll never forget. The county called a hearing to review the preliminary findings. It was held at the courthouse, a modest stone building downtown, but when I walked into that chamber and saw Karen sitting there, arms crossed, glaring daggers, I knew this was the beginning of the end for her reign of terror. The county attorney laid it all out: unauthorized fines, misuse of HOA funds, attempted encroachment, harassment of a non-member property owner, and a potential pattern of fraud stretching back years. The board members sat stiff as statues, but the moment the attorney mentioned personal liability for board members who knowingly participated, their faces drained of color. That phrase, personal liability, is the death knell for owed volunteers, because suddenly their houses, their bank accounts, their futures are on the line, not just some faceless HOA entity. By the time the hearing ended, I could already see them turning on Karen, their once proud leader, now the albatross around their necks. Outside, Dale approached me, his hands shaking as he muttered, "I never wanted this. Karen pushed us into it. I'll testify if I have to." That was the moment I knew the board was fracturing, that the solidarity Karen always boasted about was a facade held together by fear and bullying. Over the next few weeks, the walls closed in on her. The HOA insurance carrier refused to cover legal fees for actions outside their charter, meaning Karen's personal accounts were being drained to pay lawyers. Residents, furious at the skyrocketing dues and the revelation of potential fraud, started demanding special meetings to remove the board entirely. A petition circulated, gaining signatures by the day, calling for Karen's resignation. And as the pressure mounted, Karen grew more desperate, showing up at my fence in the middle of the night with a flashlight, yelling that I'd ruined everything. I didn't even bother engaging. I just called the sheriff, who now treated her like the nuisance she was, escorting her back to her subdivision like a misbehaving child. Jameson, meanwhile, was relishing every step, filing a civil claim against the HOA for harassment, legal costs and damages, knowing full well their crumbling organization couldn't withstand the pressure. What had started as a petty power play over land had spiraled into a full-scale collapse, and as I watched Karen's empire of intimidation implode, I couldn't help but marvel at the irony. She called the cops thinking she could sic the law on me, and instead she'd invited the law to dismantle her world piece by piece. And the best part? The real reckoning hadn't even arrived yet. That would come when the judge issued rulings, when fines were levied, when the residents finally realized who was truly to blame for their HOA downfall. The court date loomed like a thundercloud over the subdivision, and while Karen strutted around pretending she still held all the power, the cracks in her facade were widening so quickly it was almost comical, because behind-the-scenes residents were in open revolt, whispering in driveways, gathering in garages, signing petitions, and demanding emergency meetings to strip her of authority, and yet Karen clung to the gavel like a drowning woman clutching driftwood, barking about false accusations and outsiders ruining our community. The first big blow came when the county attorney's office formally filed charges for fraud, misrepresentation, and unlawful fines serious enough that the judge froze the HOA's operating account pending resolution, meaning no more slush funds for Karen's legal crusades. Dues payments were halted, landscaping services were suspended, the pool went uncleaned, and suddenly residents were staring at dead grass and green water, wondering why their fees were disappearing into a legal black hole. Meanwhile, Jameson pressed forward with my civil suit, carefully weaving together years of HOA overreach, harassment, and Karen's personal vendetta against me into a narrative so damning that even the judge raised an eyebrow at the pretrial conference. Karen tried to argue I was a disruptive neighbor threatening their community's harmony, but the county surveyor's maps, tax records, and deeds laid bare the truth. My land was never within their jurisdiction, never subject to their bylaws, never theirs to control. That revelation was a sledgehammer to their entire foundation, because it didn't just vindicate me, it meant every fine, every fee, every special assessment tied to that false boundary was fraudulent. And residents began to realize they'd been fleeced by their own leader. Dale and Melanie, terrified of personal liability, turned state's evidence in exchange for leniency, handing over emails that showed Karen explicitly instructed them to enforce aggressively, even if he fights back, and bragging about how much extra revenue they could squeeze by targeting properties near mine. The county attorney presented those emails like trophies in court, each one another chain tightening around Karen's neck. And then came the residents' class action. Yes, the very people Karen lorded over filed their own lawsuit against the board, demanding restitution for misused dues, inflated assessments, and violations of fiduciary duty. It was poetic justice. The woman who had built her entire identity on policing others now found herself policed by the very community she thought adored her. In court, she sputtered, waved her arms, tried to shout over witnesses, but the judge silenced her with a stern warning. Another outburst, and you'll be held in contempt. For once, Karen sat down, lips trembling, her face flushed with a mix of rage and humiliation. Outside the courthouse, reporters started circling, because a case like this HOA collapsing under fraud allegations was juicy news. Headlines blared. HOA faces fraud probe, residents blame. President for mismanagement, and county investigates HOA over false claims on land ownership. Cameras caught Karen storming from hearings, muttering about conspiracies and outsiders. Ruining everything. But the more she ranted, the more isolated she became, until even her closest allies avoided standing near her in public. Meanwhile, I kept my composure, answering questions with calm, measured statements about property rights, fairness, and accountability, exactly the kind of tone that won hearts and minds. By the time the preliminary hearings ended, it was clear. Those days were numbered. The judge scheduled a final evidentiary hearing to determine damages, and the county made it clear they intended to recommend criminal charges against Karen personally. Residents began removing HOA board signs from the clubhouse. Whispers of disbandment rippled through the neighborhood, and a group of homeowners even approached me privately to apologize for the grief Karen had caused. One man, voice heavy, with frustration, admitted, "We thought she was protecting us. Turns out she was bleeding us dry." I accepted their apologies graciously, but didn't let them off the hook entirely. After all, they'd let Karen run unchecked for years. Still, I could see the tides had turned, and Karen's once iron grip on her little empire was dissolving faster than sand in a flood. The final hearing felt less like a trial and more like an autopsy, with every misstep, every shady transaction, every unlawful action dissected in front of the judge. The county attorney recommended fines, restitution, and disbandment of the HOA as a legal entity, while Jameson pressed for damages on my behalf for harassment and legal expenses. Karen's attorney tried to paint her as overzealous but well-meaning, but when the judge asked her directly why she claimed authority over land that tax records showed she never controlled, Karen stammered, red-faced, before blurting out, "Because if we didn't, he'd ruin everything we built." That one outburst sealed her fate, because it was no longer about bylaws or boundaries, it was about personal spite, and the court saw it plain as day. By the time the gavel fell, the HOA was ordered into receivership, an independent manager, appointed to wind down its affairs, restitution funds set aside for residents, and Karen personally referred to the district attorney for potential prosecution. The courtroom buzzed with whispers, residents shaking their heads in disbelief, some even cheering quietly. I walked out into the sunlight with Jameson by my side, the weight of months of harassment finally lifting. Behind me, Karen lingered. On the courthouse steps, shoulders slumped, face pale, as reporters shoved microphones in her face asking how it felt to lose everything. She didn't answer she couldn't, and as the crowd dispersed, one truth settled in my chest with satisfying clarity. Her HOA wasn't just weakened. It was finished, its reign of terror reduced to a cautionary tale for every overreaching board in the county. But for Karen, the worst was still to come, because while she had lost her board, her money, and her community's trust, the criminal charges hanging over her head promised to strip her of the one thing she valued most, her illusion of control. The fall of Karen and her HOA should have ended at that courthouse gavel, but instead it spiraled into something far larger, a slow-motion demolition of everything she had built, each blow landing harder than the last until the woman who once strutted through the subdivision with a clipboard and a sneer was left exposed as nothing more than a fraud, who mistook bullying for leadership. Because as soon as the HOA was officially dissolved and placed into receivership, the county's investigation went into overdrive, combing through years of dues, expenditures, and falsified documents that Karen had signed with reckless arrogance. And what they uncovered made the residents' class action look like a warm-up act. Bank statements revealed she had funneled thousands of dollars into personal accounts, disguising purchases for spa trips, vacations, and even a kitchen remodel, under vague labels like community improvement or resident wellness initiatives. The district attorney seized on this like a predator, filing formal charges for embezzlement, wire fraud, and misuse of funds, each count carrying years in prison, and suddenly Karen found herself no longer a self-proclaimed protector of the neighborhood but a defendant in a criminal trial, facing the very system she once weaponized against her neighbors. The irony was not lost on me, nor on the residents who had to sit in folding chairs in a rented hall. listening as the court-appointed receiver explained that the HOA's funds were essentially gone, drained by years of mismanagement and Karen's personal greed, meaning their community association had left them poorer, angrier, and legally entangled. Some residents wept, others cursed. Still others finally admitted they should have questioned Karen long ago, but hindsight, like justice, was merciless. I attended those meetings quietly, not to gloat, but because my land and my peace had been so deeply entangled in their fiasco that I had a stake in watching it all unwind. And each time Karen's name was mentioned, the room would fill with mutters of contempt, as if she were already a ghost haunting the neighborhood she once ruled. Meanwhile, my lawsuit for damages progressed, and Jameson made sure every bit of harassment I had endured, every bogus citation, every confrontation, every sleepless night wondering if I'd come home to something vandalized, was laid out in detail. And when the judge awarded me a hefty sum in damages, Karen's attorney tried to argue she had no means to pay, but the court swiftly placed a lien on her home, her car, and her accounts, turning her suburban castle into a crumbling financial prison. Word spread quickly, and soon Karen was ostracized not only by her former allies but by the entire county, her name synonymous with arrogance, her reputation permanently stained. Residents who once marched behind her began to openly mock her, whispering, "There goes the queen without her crown," whenever she was spotted trudging through the grocery store, head bowed, sunglasses hiding her shame. But the final act came in the criminal courtroom, where Karen, dressed in a suit that no longer fit, face pale and tired, stood before a jury of 12 ordinary citizens, many of whom had lived under HOA rule themselves and needed no convincing. That power, unchecked, corrupts absolutely. The prosecution laid out its case with surgical precision: falsified ledgers, unauthorized transfers, emails bragging about using dues creatively, all punctuated by testimony from former board members who had once been her allies but now saved themselves by painting Karen as the mastermind. Her defense tried to spin it as poor bookkeeping or misunderstood community projects, but the jury wasn't buying it. And when the verdict came back guilty on multiple counts, the room was silent except for Karen's strangled gasp. The judge, stern and unsympathetic, sentenced her to several years in prison, restitution payments, and permanent disqualification from serving on any board or fiduciary role. And just like that, the woman who once called the cops on me for stepping onto my own property was escorted away in handcuffs, her reign of terror collapsing into a tragic, self-inflicted exile. As for the subdivision, without the HOA, the place began to breathe again. Residents repainted homes the way they wanted, planted gardens, hosted barbecues without fear of citation, and for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt alive instead of suffocated. Some properties lost value at first, yes, but over time, the freedom of living without Karen's oversight became a selling point, and families who valued independence moved in, reshaping the community into something healthier, freer, and more honest. My own land remained untouched, my ranch and home as peaceful as ever. But I had gained something more than victory. I had earned the respect of those who once doubted me, and the satisfaction of knowing I had outlasted Karen's cruelty without ever stooping to her level. One afternoon, months after her sentencing, I drove past the subdivision and saw kids riding bikes in the street, chalk drawings on sidewalks, and neighbors chatting over fences, a simple but powerful reminder that community doesn't come from rules, fines, and fear. It comes from trust and respect, things Karen had never understood. I smiled, rolled down my window to let the breeze carry away the last traces of bitterness, and thought about how far we'd come from that day she first tried to flex her false authority over me. Karen was gone, her was gone, and my land was still mine, a truth that no board, no gavel, no fraud could ever erase. And as I watched the sun set over the hills, I realized that sometimes the best justice isn't just seeing the guilty punished, it's living free, knowing they can never touch you again.